When we think of the Holocaust, one name rises above all others: Auschwitz. The infamous gates with the words Arbeit macht frei. The photographs of skeletal survivors liberated by the Red Army. The mountains of shoes, hair, and personal belongings preserved in museum displays. But Auschwitz, as horrifying as it was, has overshadowed a darker truth. In the eastern regions of Nazi-occupied Poland, there existed camps so lethal, so efficient, and so deliberately erased from history that today very few people even know their names. Among these forgotten sites of horror stands Belzec, a death camp that consumed nearly 500,000 lives in less than a single year, and left behind almost nothing. Unlike Auschwitz, Belzec had no vast network of labour barracks, no industrial complex of factories and workshops. It was never intended to exploit Jewish prisoners for slave labour. Belzec had only one purpose: extermination. It was what historians call a pure death camp. Trains arrived, doors opened, people were herded inside, and within hours they were dead. There was no selection process, no chance of survival, no way out. Between March and December of 1942, Belzec became a factory of death that swallowed up men, women, and children from across Poland, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. By the time it was shut down, an estimated 430,000 to 500,000 Jews had been murdered there. To put that into perspective, Belzec killed more people than the combined populations of cities like Miami, Amsterdam, or Krakow. And yet the camp remained almost invisible in the post-war memory of the Holocaust. Unlike Auschwitz, there were virtually no survivors to tell the story. Historians estimate that only 2 or 3 prisoners managed to escape Belzec and live to bear witness. With so few voices, and with the Nazis going to extreme lengths to destroy the evidence of the camp's existence, Belzec became known as the Forgotten Camp. But forgotten does not mean unimportant. In fact, Belzec was a prototype, a test site for what the Nazis would later expand at Sobibor and Treblinka. It was here that they perfected the grim mechanics of mass killing, using deception, speed, and crude but effective technology to annihilate entire communities in a matter of hours. This is the story of Belzec, a camp designed for silence, a camp designed to leave no witnesses, a camp designed to erase entire peoples from existence and then erase itself from history. In this documentary, we will uncover how Belzec was conceived, how it operated, who was sent there, and how the Nazis attempted to hide its crimes from the world. We will hear from the rare survivors who escaped its grasp, and we will explore how this place, once a centre of industrial-scale killing, is remembered today. If Auschwitz was the face of the Holocaust that the world came to recognize, then Belzec is the ghost, a shadow in history, a warning of how far human cruelty can go when paired with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. Let us step back to the origins of this camp, to the world of 1941, when the Nazi regime began planning what would become the most systematic genocide in human history, the final solution. To understand Belzec, we must step into the year 1941, when Nazi Germany was at the height of its military power. In June, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military campaign in history, and with it came unprecedented brutality. The Nazi leadership framed the war in the East not as a traditional conflict between armies, but as a racial war of annihilation. The Jews of Eastern Europe were depicted as the enemy within, conspirators of communism, parasites that had to be eradicated. As German forces swept across Poland and deep into Soviet territory, they encountered millions of Jews living in towns, villages, and ghettos. Suddenly, the Nazi regime was faced with what they saw as a problem: what to do with these vast populations. At first, mass shootings were the solution. Mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed behind the German army, rounding up Jewish men, women, and children, marching them to pits and executing them by the thousands. These massacres, in places like Babi Yar near Kyiv, where over 33,000 Jews were slaughtered in just 2 days, represented an escalation of violence. But even the Nazis soon realized this method was inefficient and psychologically burdensome for the shooters themselves. The leadership began to search for a more systematic, more industrial method of mass murder. In late 1941, the outlines of the final solution began to take shape. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, called for a coordinated plan to annihilate the Jews of occupied Poland. After Heydrich's assassination in 1942, the program would bear his name, Operation Reinhard. The goal was chillingly clear: to exterminate the Jews of the general government, the central part of occupied Poland under direct Nazi control. This region contained about 2 million Jews. To carry out their plan, the Nazis would construct a network of extermination camps designed solely for murder. The first of these would be Belzec. Why Belzec? The site chosen for Belzec was a small village in southeastern Poland near the city of Lublin. Several factors made it ideal for the Nazis' purposes. Location on railway lines: Belzec sat on the Lublin-Lwów line, with easy connections to ghettos across Galicia and central Poland. Trains could arrive directly at the camp. Secluded area: the region was rural, wooded, and relatively remote, making secrecy easier. Existing forced labour camp. Before Belzec became an extermination site, the Nazis had already used the location for forced labour in 1940. This provided cover for the new construction. The SS commander responsible for Operation Reinhard was Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police leader in Lublin. Ruthless and ambitious, Globoknik had been given direct authority by Heinrich Himmler to organize the extermination camps. Globoknik chose Christian Wirth to oversee construction and operation at Belzec. Wirth had a dark resume. He was a veteran of the so-called T4 euthanasia program, in which the Nazis murdered tens of thousands of disabled and mentally ill people in Germany between 1939 and 1941. He had experience running gas chambers, using carbon monoxide to kill victims under the guise of medical treatment. Belzec would take those techniques and apply them on a far greater scale. Work on Belzec began in November 1941. Prisoners from nearby labour camps, guarded by the SS and Ukrainian auxiliaries, were forced to clear land and build the camp. The design reflected its sole purpose: extermination. Unlike concentration camps such as Dachau or Buchenwald, which had barracks, workshops, and administrative complexes, Belzec was divided into just 2 main areas: the reception zone, where trains arrived, victims were unloaded, stripped of belongings, and deceived into thinking they were being taken to showers; the extermination zone, containing gas chambers and mass burial pits. A narrow fenced path, later nicknamed the Tube, connected these 2 zones. Once victims entered the tube, there was no way back. The camp was small, covering only about 300 by 400 meters, roughly 30 acres. Yet within this confined space, the Nazis would orchestrate one of the most intense killing campaigns in history. By March 1942, Belzec was ready. Its first victims were deported Jews from nearby ghettos in the Lublin district. The killing methods were still experimental. At first, the camp used 3 small gas chambers, each capable of holding about 200 people, fueled by exhaust from a Soviet tank engine. Technical flaws plagued these early attempts. Sometimes the engine failed to start, prolonging victims' agony. Other times corpses piled up so quickly that burial became a logistical nightmare. But as months passed, the SS refined their methods. New, larger gas chambers were constructed, capable of killing hundreds at a time. Cremation methods were later introduced to erase evidence. Belzec was not just a camp, it was a prototype, a gruesome laboratory for mass killing. What was developed here would later be applied with deadly efficiency at Sobibor and Treblinka. By the spring of 1942, Belzec stood as the first true extermination camp of Operation Reinhard. What had begun as an idea, to move beyond mass shootings into industrialized murder, was now a grim reality. The next chapter in Belzec's story would reveal how this small camp became a place of unimaginable destruction, a conveyor belt of death that could annihilate entire communities in a matter of days. Belzec was not a sprawling complex of barracks and factories. It was not a place of prolonged imprisonment. It was, from the ground up, a machine for murder. Its design reflected that single purpose with brutal simplicity. The camp was small, about 300 by 400 meters, roughly the size of 4 football fields, and yet within that tiny space, the Nazis engineered a facility capable of annihilating hundreds of thousands of people in less than a year. Belzec was divided into 2 main sections: the reception zone. This was the area where transports arrived. It included a railway siding with a ramp, a platform where victims disembarked, and a large open square where they were gathered. Surrounding buildings included a small barracks for guards, storerooms for luggage, and undressing barracks where victims were told to leave their clothing. Here, deception was critical. Victims were often told they were at a transit camp, or that they were simply being deloused and given showers before continuing their journey. To reinforce this lie, signs pointed to baths and showers. The gas chamber building was even disguised as a bathhouse, complete with fake doors and windows. Beyond the reception area lay the killing sector, hidden behind tall wooden fences interwoven with pine branches to block outside view. This zone contained the gas chamber building, burial pits, and later cremation pyres. It was accessible only via a single narrow pathway known as the tube, a fenced, camouflaged corridor that funneled victims straight from the undressing area to their deaths. Once someone entered the tube, there was no escape. The tube was about 100 meters long and 2 meters wide, constructed from barbed wire fences covered with brushwood to conceal what lay ahead. Prisoners were forced to run through it naked, beaten and prodded by guards and dogs amid shouts and blows. The psychological effect was devastating. There was no time to think, no chance to resist. By the time victims realized where they were being taken, the gas chamber doors were already closing behind them. The heart of Belzec was its gas chamber building. In the camp's early months, 3 small chambers were constructed, each about 4 by 5 meters, capable of holding 200 victims at a time. These rooms were airtight, with wooden walls sealed by clay. The killing method was crude but effective. A captured Soviet tank engine, stripped from the battlefield, was installed outside the building. Its exhaust pipe was connected to the chambers. When the engine was started, carbon monoxide was pumped into the sealed rooms, suffocating those inside. Death usually took 15 to 30 minutes. As transports increased in frequency and the camp's productivity was demanded to rise, these small chambers proved inadequate. In mid-1942, a new building was constructed with 6 larger chambers, each holding 500 to 600 people. Now up to 2,000 victims could be murdered simultaneously. The system was brutally efficient. Trains arrived, victims were unloaded, stripped, herded into the chambers, and killed within hours. The next train could then roll in, and the process repeated. Belzec's design relied not only on physical structures but on deception. The Nazis knew that panic and resistance could slow down their operation. To maintain order, they used a combination of lies and brute force. Signs with arrows directed victims toward showers. SS men gave short speeches explaining that disinfection was necessary before resettlement. Prisoners were ordered to tie their shoes together and neatly stack their belongings, reinforcing the illusion that they would reclaim them later. All of this created a false sense of procedure. Only when it was too late did many realize what awaited them. The camp was manned by a small cadre of SS officers, perhaps 20 to 30 in total. supported by about 90 to 120 Ukrainian auxiliaries known as Troniki men. These auxiliaries had been recruited from Soviet prisoners of war and trained by the SS. The guards' barracks and watchtowers were positioned around the perimeter, ensuring total control. The entire camp was enclosed by a double barbed wire fence, again camouflaged with branches to hide it from prying eyes. Behind the gas chambers stretched massive pits dug by excavators where corpses were dumped. Each pit could hold thousands of bodies. In the early months, victims were buried in layers, one atop another, the earth quickly becoming saturated with decomposing remains. The stench was overwhelming, spreading for kilometers around. Local villagers spoke of the air filled with smoke and the sickly sweet odor of decay. Flies swarmed in vast numbers, covering the camp and surrounding areas. The sheer number of corpses soon made burial unsustainable. By late 1942, following Himmler's orders to erase evidence, bodies were exhumed and burned on open-air pyres. Massive grills made of railway tracks were constructed, where corpses were stacked like firewood and set alight. This grisly process would continue until the camp's closure. Belzec's layout tells us everything about its purpose. There were no large prisoner barracks, no hospitals, no workshops. Victims did not live in Belzec. They died there, usually within hours of arrival. The camp's architecture embodied the Nazi vision of genocide: deception, efficiency, and erasure. It was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to vanish, to do its deadly work, cover its tracks, and disappear from history. By mid-1942, Belzec was fully operational. Its chambers roared day and night with the sound of engines, its pits overflowed with the dead, its skies were darkened with smoke. The camp had become a conveyor belt of death, a prototype of industrial genocide that would soon be copied at Sobibor and Treblinka. But what did the daily operation of this death factory look like? What happened from the moment a train pulled into Belzec until its passengers had been reduced to ashes? That is the story of the next chapter, the daily operation of the camp. By the spring of 1942, Belzec was no longer an experiment. It was a fully functioning death factory. Trains from all over the general government began to arrive on a regular basis. Each train carried between 40 and 60 cattle cars, jammed with anywhere from 80 to 120 people per car. Conditions during transport were horrific. Days without food or water, suffocating heat in summer, freezing cold in winter. Many were already dead when the train doors finally slid open. The camp's railway siding branched directly off the Lublin-Lvov line, leading into the reception area. As the train screeched to a halt, guards shouted orders in German and Ukrainian. The doors were flung open and people were driven out with whips, rifle butts, and barking dogs. The scene was one of chaos and fear. Families clutched each other, children cried, the sick collapsed on the ground. SS men and Troniki auxiliaries shouted commands. Raus! Schnell! Faster! Faster! Those who could not move quickly enough were beaten or shot on the spot. Victims were herded into a large square in front of the unloading platform. Here the deception began. An SS officer, often Christian Wirth himself or one of his subordinates, addressed the crowd. His words followed a carefully crafted script. You are at a transit camp. From here, you will be taken to labor camps where you will work. But first, you must go through disinfection. You will leave your clothing and valuables here, bathe, and then receive fresh clothing and continue your journey. The speech was delivered with cold authority. The goal was not to comfort, but to impose order and reduce panic. The illusion of baths and resettlement was essential. Panic meant resistance. Order meant efficiency. After the speech, prisoners were ordered to hand over their luggage. Suitcases, bags, and bundles were piled high, later sorted by camp workers for valuables, clothing, and other usable goods. Men and women were separated. Victims were herded into undressing barracks or open-air yards. Orders were shouted, "Remove everything!" Shoes, belts, jewelry, all clothing. Those who hesitated were beaten. Women were often forced to cut their hair, later sent to Germany for use in textiles. Naked and humiliated, people were driven toward the narrow fenced path known as the tube. The tube stretched about 100 meters, enclosed by barbed wire and camouflaged with branches. Guards lined the path, prodding, whipping, and driving the victims forward. Accounts describe the terror of this final walk. Mothers tried to shield their children. The elderly stumbled, beaten until they fell. Dogs lunged at the naked prisoners. There was no turning back. At the end of the tube stood a low, windowless building, the gas chamber. The building resembled a bathhouse, complete with signs and fake doors. Prisoners were forced inside, crammed tightly together until the rooms could hold no more. The doors were then sealed shut. Outside, a Ukrainian auxiliary started the captured tank engine. Its exhaust pipe funneled carbon monoxide into the chamber. At first, victims screamed, pounded on the walls, clawed at the doors. Within minutes, the noise gave way to gasps, choking, silence. After 15 to 30 minutes, all inside were dead. The doors were opened, and members of the Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners forced to assist under threat of death, dragged out the bodies. The corpses were covered in urine, excrement, and vomit, their faces frozen in agony. Gold teeth were pried out with pliers, rings and jewellery were torn from fingers. At first, bodies were thrown into enormous pits dug behind the chambers. Layers of corpses were covered with thin layers of soil. But decomposition soon created enormous problems. Gases forced bodies to the surface. Liquids seeped into the ground, contaminating wells and filling the air with a nauseating stench. By mid-1942, the SS began experimenting with cremation. Corpses were exhumed and burned on pyres made from railway tracks. Thousands of bodies at a time were reduced to ash, bones crushed with hammers to obliterate evidence. The smoke from these pyres could be seen for miles. Villagers in surrounding areas recalled skies blackened with soot, the constant smell of burning flesh. The work of handling bodies, digging pits, and burning corpses was done by the Sonderkommando, small groups of Jewish prisoners kept alive temporarily. Their tasks were horrific, guiding victims into chambers, removing bodies, extracting valuables. The Sonderkommando lived in constant terror. They knew their lives were measured in weeks, perhaps months. Periodically, the SS would execute entire work details to eliminate witnesses and replace them with new arrivals. Only a handful of Sonderkommando from Belzec survived long enough to escape or give testimony after the war. Belzec was designed for speed. A single transport of 2,000 to 3,000 people could be processed, unloaded, stripped, gassed, and buried within just a few hours. Trains often arrived back-to-back, day after day. Estimates suggest that at the height of operations, Belzec was killing between 10,000 and 15,000 people per day. Unlike Auschwitz, where many were selected for labour, at Belzec nearly everyone was sent directly to the gas chambers. Only a tiny fraction, skilled workers, barbers, sorters, Sonderkommando, were kept alive briefly. For the vast majority, arrival meant death within 2 hours. For the SS and guards, daily life was a mix of routine and sadistic cruelty. Commandants like Christian Wirth were notorious for their brutality. Guards drank heavily, beat prisoners for sport, and staged cruel games with captives. Survivor accounts describe guards forcing prisoners to sing songs as they marched naked to the gas chambers, mocking them until the last moment. The Ukrainian auxiliaries, many drawn from Soviet POW camps, were infamous for their violence. Armed with clubs, whips, and dogs, they carried out much of the physical brutality. Perhaps the most chilling feature of Belzec's operation was its silence in the historical record. Unlike Auschwitz, where tens of thousands survived to testify, Belzec left almost no survivors. Historians estimate that only 2 or 3 Jewish prisoners managed to escape and later bear witness. Rudolf Raeder and Chaim Hirschman are the best known. Their accounts, combined with testimony from nearby villagers and post-war investigations, form nearly the entire basis of what we know about Belzec's daily operations. The Nazis intended it that way. Belzec was not a place for imprisonment, it was not a place for survival, it was a place of erasure. By December 1942, in less than a single year, Belzec had fulfilled its horrific purpose. An estimated 500,000 human beings had been reduced to ash and memory. But the Nazis were not content to simply shut the gates and leave. They knew that such crimes could not remain hidden forever. What followed was an equally chilling chapter: the systematic cover-up of Belzec, an attempt to erase the camp from the earth itself. Belzec operated for only 9 months, from March to December of 1942. In that short span, it consumed more lives than almost any other single Nazi camp, yet remains far less known. Estimates vary, but historians place the number of victims between 430,000 and 500,000 people. To put that in perspective, in less than a year, Belzec killed more Jews than the entire population of cities like Krakow, Warsaw's Jewish ghetto at its height, or even modern-day Miami. Belzec's victims came primarily from the general government, Nazi-occupied central and southeastern Poland. The camp was located in the Lublin district, making it the logical destination for deportations from nearby ghettos. Galicia district. Hundreds of thousands of Jews from cities like Lvov, Lviv, Tarnów, and Stanisławów were deported here. Entire communities vanished in a matter of weeks. Lublin district. Jews from the ghettos of Zamość, Chełm, and surroundings were sent directly to Belzec. Radom and Krakow districts. Transports from smaller towns in central Poland also flowed into the camp. Germany and Austria. Some transports of Jews from Vienna and Berlin were sent to Belzec, though the majority of Western deportees were directed to Sobibor or Treblinka. The railway network made this possible. Belzec was strategically located along the Lublin-Lvov line, with spurs connecting to many ghettos. Deportations were carefully scheduled so that trains could arrive in a steady flow, often daily. Belzec's killing rate was staggering. Once operational, the camp often processed multiple transports per day. Historian estimates suggest that in peak months like August and September 1942, the camp was murdering 10,000 to 15,000 people per day. Unlike Auschwitz, where prisoners were often selected for labor, Belzec was designed for immediate extermination. This meant that virtually every arrival ended in death. Men, women, children, the elderly, all were murdered within hours. The victims of Belzec represented the full diversity of Jewish life in Poland and Eastern Europe. Families from shtetls, small Jewish towns, as well as educated professionals from large cities, were swept into the same transports. Rabbis, doctors, craftsmen, shopkeepers, teachers, children, entire communities disappeared. Some victims were Roma and Sinti, though their numbers at Belzec were far smaller than at camps like Auschwitz. Political prisoners and local non-Jewish resistors were occasionally executed there as well, but Belzec's purpose remained almost exclusively the annihilation of Jews. One of the most haunting aspects of Belzec is the near-total absence of survivors. Out of nearly 500,000 victims, historians can identify only 2 or 3 individuals who escaped and lived to tell the story. Rudolf Raeder, deported from Lwów in 1942, managed to escape while working in the camp. He later gave testimony in 1946, which became one of the most detailed accounts of Belzec's operations. Chaim Hirschman, another survivor, testified after the war, but was assassinated by anti-communist partisans in Poland in 1946, before his full account could be recorded. A few other escapees are mentioned in records, but their fates remain uncertain. The lack of witnesses meant that for decades, Belzec remained shrouded in silence. Unlike Auschwitz, which left thousands of survivors to testify, Belzec had almost no human voices to tell the world what had happened there. For the victims, there was no time for final letters, no chance to leave behind testimony, no opportunity even for last words to loved ones. People arrived, were stripped of their belongings, and within an hour or two were dead. This absence of survivors is one of the reasons Belzec has remained less well known in public memory. Without living witnesses, the camp became what some historians call a black hole of history, a place where almost 500,000 human beings were erased almost without a trace. Modern research, particularly studies conducted by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Polish historians, places the death toll at approximately 434,500 Jews based on surviving transport records. But the true number may never be known. Many transports left no paperwork. Entire villages were deported without record. In reality, the total is likely closer to 500,000. Belzec's victims cannot be counted as mere statistics. They were mothers carrying infants, children clutching dolls, grandparents leaning on canes, young men and women filled with dreams and fears. In the span of a few hours, entire family lines that had survived for centuries were extinguished. The enormity of the crime lies not just in the numbers, but in the silence that followed. With almost no survivors, Belzec's dead were left without voices to speak for them. In the next section, we will turn from the victims to the perpetrators, the SS officers, guards, and collaborators who ran the camp. Who were they, and how did they live in a place built for industrial-scale murder? Belzec was a small camp, but it killed on a massive scale. The chilling truth is that this machinery of death was operated by only a handful of men. Fewer than 40 SS officers and between 90 and 120 Ukrainian auxiliaries, known as Troniki men, carried out the extermination of nearly 500,000 people. At the top of Belzec's chain of command was Odilo Globoknik, SS and police leader of the Lublin district. Though he rarely visited the camp, it was Globoknik who oversaw the entire Operation Reinhard program, including Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka. He was directly responsible to Heinrich Himmler, who had ordered the annihilation of the Jews of Poland. Globoknik entrusted Belzec to Christian Wirth, one of the most notorious figures of the Holocaust. Christian Wirth, known by the nickname the Wild Christian, was a veteran of the Nazi euthanasia program, or Action T4. There, he supervised the gassing of disabled and mentally ill patients in Germany, using carbon monoxide chambers disguised as showers. At Belzec, Wirth applied these methods on a much larger scale. Survivors and post-war witnesses described him as brutal, fanatical, and sadistic. He beat prisoners personally, staged executions, and demanded absolute obedience from his men. Wirth was obsessed with efficiency, treating Belzec as a laboratory to perfect the mechanics of mass killing. Later, Wirth would oversee operations at Sobibor and Treblinka, but Belzec was his testing ground. In August 1942, command of Belzec was transferred to SS Hauptsturmführer Gottlieb Hering. Hering had been a police officer before joining the SS, and like Wirth, had participated in the T4 program. Under Hering's watch, the camp continued its deadly pace. Witnesses described him as less openly violent than Wirth, but no less committed to the extermination process. By the time Belzec was dismantled in late 1942, Hering had overseen the killing of hundreds of thousands. Belzec's SS staff numbered only about 20 to 30 men at any given time. Many were veterans of Action T4, handpicked because they had already proven themselves capable of mass murder without hesitation. Among them were Josef Oberhauser, Wirth's deputy, later the only SS man from Belzec ever tried in court; Lorenz Hackenholt, the man responsible for operating the gas chambers, literally the engine of death; Fritz Giermann, Heinrich Gley, and others, officers overseeing transports, selections, and camp security. These men lived in relative comfort compared to their prisoners. They had barracks, good food, alcohol, and access to confiscated goods taken from victims. Their daily work was organizing, supervising, and sometimes directly participating in killing operations. The bulk of Belzec's day-to-day brutality fell on the Ukrainian auxiliaries, recruited from Soviet prisoners of war and trained at the SS camp in Troniki. Numbering around 90 to 120, these men served as guards, escorts, and enforcers. The Troniki men were notorious for their violence. They drove victims from trains, beat and whipped them in the undressing yards, and forced them through the tube into the gas chambers. They patrolled the camp perimeter, ensuring no one escaped. Accounts describe them as often drunk, cruel, and eager to impress their SS superiors. Their role was indispensable. With only a few dozen SS men on site, it was the Troniki guards who provided the manpower to keep the machinery of death running. Life for the camp staff revolved around a grotesque mixture of routine and sadism. Killing became normalized, part of the daily schedule. But it was not just bureaucratic efficiency. There was also cruelty for cruelty's sake. Witnesses described guards setting dogs on prisoners for sport, forcing victims to sing songs as they marched naked to their deaths, and mocking them in their final moments. Executions for amusement were common. A man might be shot because a guard was bored or because he stumbled while undressing. Alcohol fueled much of this brutality. SS officers and Troniki guards often drank heavily after processing transports, celebrating their work with looted goods, food, and drink stolen from their victims. What is perhaps most chilling is the small scale of the staff compared to the enormity of the killing. With fewer than 150 men, Belzec annihilated 500,000 people. The division of labor created psychological distance. One man operated the engine, another herded victims, another recorded train arrivals. No single individual needed to see the entire process. Each was just a cog in the machine. And yet, together, they created an industrial killing apparatus unlike anything the world had seen. Few of Belzec's perpetrators faced justice. Christian Wirth was killed by partisans in 1944. Gottlieb Hering died in 1945. Lorenz Hackenholt disappeared after the war, never captured. Only one SS officer, Josef Oberhauser, was ever tried in connection with Belzec. In 1965, a German court sentenced him to just 4.5 years in prison for accessory to murder. He served his sentence and lived freely until his death in 1979. The Troniki guards, dispersed after the war, blended back into civilian life. Some were prosecuted decades later, especially those who emigrated to the United States or Canada and were discovered by investigators. But for the most part, the men of Belzec escaped accountability. At Belzec, a small group of perpetrators wielded unimaginable power. They transformed a patch of Polish countryside into a machine of death, running on schedules, engines, and lies. For them, it was daily routine. For their victims, it was the end of the world. But by late 1942, Belzec's work was nearly complete. The ghettos of southeastern Poland had been emptied, their populations reduced to ash. The camp had served its purpose. And now the Nazis turned to the next phase of their plan, covering up the evidence of what had been done. By December 1942, Belzec had completed its grim mission. The ghettos of southeastern Poland lay empty. Nearly 500,000 people had been transported to this small patch of countryside and annihilated. With its work done, the Nazis shut the camp down. But they did not simply abandon it. Heinrich Himmler and the SS leadership knew that Belzec, like the other Operation Reinhard camps, was a crime scene on an unimaginable scale. If discovered, its pits and chambers would reveal the full horror of the final solution. To prevent this, the Nazis launched one of history's most chilling cover-up operations. Sonderaction 1005. In the summer of 1942, Himmler ordered that the corpses of murdered Jews be exhumed and destroyed to conceal the scale of mass killings. The order came after reports of the stench and visible evidence reaching local populations, and even the German civilian administration. At Belzec, this meant unearthing the hundreds of thousands of bodies buried in massive pits around the gas chambers. Prisoner labour squads, drawn from the Sonderkommando, were forced to dig up the decomposing remains. The work was nightmarish. Corpses were swollen, blackened, and fused together from months in the ground. Gas from decomposition caused the earth to shift and heave. Prisoners worked with shovels and bare hands, pulling apart bodies that crumbled to pieces, stacking them on enormous pyres made from railway tracks. The pyres were primitive but devastatingly effective. Steel rails were laid across concrete supports, forming open-air grills. Corpses were stacked in layers, alternating with firewood. Once lit, the flames consumed thousands at a time. The smell of burning flesh filled the air for miles around. Villagers recalled thick black smoke that lingered for days, the ash drifting like snow across fields and rooftops. To hasten the process, SS men poured gasoline over the piles. After the fires burned down, prisoners were forced to crush remaining bones with hammers and grind them into powder. Ashes were scattered over the campgrounds, mixed with soil, or dumped into nearby rivers and fields. The goal was total obliteration, not only of the victims' bodies, but of any physical evidence that Belzec had ever existed. Once the cremations were completed, the Nazis dismantled the camp itself. Barracks, fences, and the gas chamber building were torn down. Bricks and lumber were hauled away for reuse elsewhere. Watchtowers were taken down. In place of the death camp, the SS planted trees and crops. The site was landscaped to resemble ordinary farmland. To make the disguise more convincing, a small farmhouse was built, and a Ukrainian settler family was moved in to live there. To a casual passerby, Belzec appeared to be just another farmstead in rural Poland. The last stage of the cover-up was the elimination of the witnesses. The Jewish Sonderkommando forced to exhume and burn the bodies were themselves executed once the work was complete. Only a handful managed to escape during or after the operation. By early 1943, Belzec had effectively vanished. The ground where nearly 500,000 people had died now looked like any other patch of farmland. Yet the cover-up was never perfect. Locals remembered the smoke, the smell, the endless trains. They saw the ash that drifted through the air, the greasy residue that clung to soil and water. Even decades later, archaeologists found bone fragments and ash beneath the surface. But at the time, with the camp dismantled and its prisoners murdered, the Nazis had succeeded in silencing Belzec. Unlike Auschwitz, which was liberated with much of its infrastructure intact, Belzec left behind almost nothing. No barracks, no gas chambers, no visible ruins. Only the scarred earth and the memories of villagers hinted at what had taken place there. For the Nazis, erasing Belzec was part of their broader plan to hide the final solution. Himmler knew that the war might not last forever, and that someday questions would be asked. By destroying camps like Belzec, the regime hoped to deny future generations the evidence of their crimes. This strategy was disturbingly effective. After the war, while Auschwitz became a symbol of Nazi atrocities, Belzec remained obscure. With no survivors to tell their stories and no camp structures left standing, the memory of Belzec faded into the margins of history. By the time the Red Army reached the region in 1944, nothing remained but traces: scorched ground, scattered ashes, faint depressions where mass graves had been. The farmhouse stood as camouflage, its presence a grotesque mask over the crime scene beneath. Belzec had become what the Nazis intended: a ghost, erased from the landscape, almost erased from memory. The cover-up was successful in the short term, but history has a way of remembering. Witnesses, survivors, and evidence, however scarce, would eventually expose the truth. When the Red Army advanced into southeastern Poland in the summer of 1944, they crossed the area where Belzec had once stood. What they found was not a camp, but farmland. The gas chambers, barracks, and fences were gone. The ground had been levelled, trees planted, and a farmhouse built where the camp once stood. At first glance, Belzec looked like nothing more than an ordinary rural settlement. But the land itself told another story. Beneath the thin cover of grass and crops lay ash, bone fragments, and the faint outlines of enormous mass graves. The Soviets quickly realized that this was not just farmland. It was a crime scene. Soviet investigators, part of the Extraordinary State Commission on Nazi Crimes, began examining the site in late 1944. They interviewed local villagers, who described the constant trains, the smoke, the stench, and the ash that had covered their fields. Witnesses pointed to areas where mass graves had been dug, and where cremation pyres had once burned day and night. Even though the Nazis had done everything possible to erase Belzec, traces remained. The soil was saturated with human remains. When investigators dug into the earth, they uncovered charred bones and ash. Yet, unlike Auschwitz, which the Soviets liberated intact in January 1945, Belzec offered little visible infrastructure. There were no barracks filled with prisoners, no warehouses crammed with victims' belongings. Belzec had been a camp designed for erasure, and the Nazis had succeeded. The lack of living survivors made Belzec's story even harder to reconstruct. Only 2 or 3 Jewish prisoners are known to have escaped and survived the war. Rudolf Raeder, deported from Lwów in 1942, gave detailed testimony in 1946. His account became one of the primary sources on Belzec. He described the arrival of transports, the gas chambers, the burning of corpses, and the sadism of the guards. Without his testimony, much of what we know about Belzec would be lost. Chaim Hirschman, another escapee, survived the war, but was assassinated by anti-communist partisans in 1946, before his full testimony could be recorded. This near-total absence of survivors meant that Belzec never had the chorus of witness voices that brought Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, or Dachau into global consciousness. Bringing the perpetrators of Belzec to justice proved extraordinarily difficult. By the time the war ended, many of the key figures were already dead. Christian Wirth, the camp's first commandant, was killed by partisans in Italy in 1944. Gottlieb Hering, who commanded Belzec after Wirth, died in 1945. Lorenz Hackenholt, the man who operated the gas chambers, disappeared after the war and was never found. The one major figure to face trial was Josef Oberhauser, Wirth's deputy at Belzec. Arrested in West Germany in the 1960s, Oberhauser was tried in 1965 during the so-called Belzec trial. The results were disappointing. Oberhauser was convicted not of direct murder, but of being an accessory to the murder of approximately 300,000 people. His sentence, just 4 years and 6 months in prison. He served his time, returned to civilian life, and died in 1979. Other SS men and Trauniki guards who served at Belzec mostly escaped justice. Many blended back into civilian life in Germany, Austria, or Eastern Europe. Some emigrated abroad, living quietly under assumed identities. While a few were later tracked down and stripped of citizenship in the United States or Canada, prosecutions were rare and often symbolic. Several factors explain why so few of Belzec's perpetrators were punished. Lack of survivors. With almost no witnesses, there was little direct testimony to convict perpetrators. Erasure of evidence. The Nazis' destruction of the camp made forensic proof difficult. Cold War politics. As East and West divided, prosecuting former Nazis often became a low priority. Compared to Auschwitz, Dachau, or Nuremberg, Belzec simply did not generate the same momentum for justice. This combination of erasure, silence, and failed justice pushed Belzec into obscurity. For decades, the camp was scarcely mentioned in textbooks or public memory. Many in Poland, Germany, and beyond had never heard of it. When people thought of the Holocaust, they thought of Auschwitz. Belzec, despite its death toll, remained almost invisible. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s that serious efforts began to study and memorialize Belzec properly. Archaeological investigations revealed the outlines of mass graves and confirmed the scale of extermination. Historians pieced together transport records and witness statements to reconstruct what had happened. In 2004, a new memorial and museum was opened on the site of Belzec, ensuring that its history would no longer remain forgotten. The modern memorial covers the mass graves with a stark field of stone and concrete, symbolizing both absence and remembrance. Belzec's aftermath is defined by silence: the silence of the murdered, the silence of the absent survivors, the silence of a world that looked away for too long. Justice failed, memory faltered, but the truth has slowly re-emerged. In the next section, we will look more closely at how Belzec is remembered today, the memorialization of the site, the role of archaeology, and the struggle against forgetting. For decades after the war, Belzec was a ghost. The camp had been dismantled, its victims erased without trace, its perpetrators largely unpunished. Unlike Auschwitz, Dachau, or Majdanek, there were no ruins to walk through, no barracks or chimneys to confront the eye. Belzec was silence. In the years immediately following 1945, the site of Belzec received little attention. Poland, devastated by the war and under Soviet control, had limited resources for preserving memory. The visible structures of the camp were gone, and only local villagers remembered the stench, the ash, and the endless trains. In 1945, a small wooden cross was erected on the site. Later, in the 1960s, a modest stone memorial was placed there by the Polish government. But for the most part, Belzec remained forgotten, visited rarely, and maintained poorly. Weeds grew over the mass graves. Locals sometimes scavenged for bones or valuables. The camp that had swallowed 500,000 souls looked more like an abandoned field than a sacred place. What preserved Belzec from complete oblivion were the testimonies of the few who had survived. Rudolf Raeder's account in 1946 described the camp's layout, the gas chambers, the tube, the disposal of bodies. His words, though coming from one voice among 500,000 silenced, became a cornerstone of historical understanding. Historians in the West began to piece together transport records and Nazi documents that pointed to Belzec's scale. But still, public awareness lagged behind. Auschwitz dominated the narrative of the Holocaust. Belzec was often a footnote. In the 1990s, serious efforts began to uncover Belzec's hidden history. Archaeologist Andrzej Koller led a groundbreaking investigation of the site between 1997 and 1999. Because Jewish law forbids the disturbance of graves, the team used non-invasive methods: core drilling, soil analysis, and careful mapping. What they found was staggering. 33 mass graves were identified, ranging from 5 to 30 meters long and up to 15 meters deep. In some pits, ash and bone fragments formed layers several meters thick. The estimated number of bodies confirmed earlier historical research: between 430,000 and 500,000 victims. These findings provided undeniable physical evidence of the scale of extermination at Belzec, even though the Nazis had tried to erase every trace. In 2004, after years of planning and international cooperation, a new memorial and museum was opened at Belzec. Funded by the Polish government and the American Jewish Committee, it transformed the forgotten site into a place of solemn remembrance. The design is stark and haunting. Visitors enter through a narrow path, enclosed by towering walls of rust-coloured steel, symbolising the tube through which victims were driven to their deaths. The central memorial covers the mass graves with a vast field of jagged stone. No grass, no trees, only broken rock, symbolising destruction and absence. At the far end stands a wall inscribed with the names of 600 communities whose Jews were murdered at Belzec. Inside the museum, exhibitions tell the story of the camp using survivor testimony, Nazi documents and archaeological findings. The memorial is not large, but its atmosphere is overwhelming. Silence dominates. Belzec's story is not just about numbers. It is about the danger of forgetting. For decades, the camp was erased, first by the Nazis, then by neglect, then by historical obscurity. Only in recent years has it re-entered the global narrative of the Holocaust. Remembering Belzec serves several purposes. To honour the victims, 500,000 people murdered, with almost no survivors to speak for them. To preserve truth, against denial and distortion, physical evidence and memorialization stand as proof. To confront erasure, Belzec shows how genocide not only kills, but seeks to erase memory itself. Belzec today is quiet. The stones lie still, the trees whisper in the wind, the soil holds the ashes of hundreds of thousands. Visitors walk through in silence, confronted not by ruins but by absence, the absence of life, of voices, of memory itself. And yet, in that absence, remembrance takes root. The victims of Belzec, once silenced, are no longer forgotten. Belzec was not the largest camp of the Holocaust. It left behind no iconic ruins, no vast museum collections, no legions of survivors to testify. It existed for less than a year, and yet in that short time it murdered nearly 500,000 people. That staggering number rivals the populations of entire cities. It represents centuries of Jewish life in Galicia, Lublin and beyond, entire communities of shopkeepers, teachers, rabbis, children, mothers and fathers, all extinguished in a matter of months. Unlike Auschwitz, where survivors carried the memory forward, Belzec was almost silent. Only 2 or 3 escaped to bear witness. The rest were swallowed by the earth, their bodies exhumed and burned, their voices lost forever. The Nazis designed Belzec not only to kill, but to erase. They dismantled its structures, ploughed over its grounds, planted trees, and built a farmhouse where gas chambers once stood. They sought to make it as if nothing had happened. And for decades they nearly succeeded. But history has a way of resisting silence. The soil still held its secrets. Witnesses in nearby villages still remembered the trains, the smoke, the ash. Survivor testimony, however scarce, gave words to the unspeakable. Archaeology and research restored the evidence. Today, Belzec stands again, not as a functioning camp, but as a memorial of stone, steel, and silence. It forces us to confront the reality of what was done there and what it means when human beings turn bureaucracy and technology toward annihilation. The lesson of Belzec is twofold. First, it is a warning. Genocide does not require massive armies or endless resources. With fewer than 150 men, the Nazis murdered 500,000. It requires only ideology, organization, and the dehumanization of an other. Second, it is a plea for memory. Belzec shows how genocide kills not only people, but remembrance itself. To forget Belzec would be to grant the perpetrators their final victory. To remember is to resist. As we conclude this story, let us recall the words of survivor Rudolf Rader, whose testimony became one of the only voices to rise from Belzec's silence. He wrote, "Everything was planned in Belzec for the purpose of mass killing and for no other purpose. It was a place built to kill us all. 500,000 people entered Belzec, almost none returned. Today we speak their names, we tell their story, and in doing so we ensure that Belzec will never again be forgotten.